So one of the huge blessings of getting to MC this event is getting to speak to some of the speakers, and I was so excited to talk to Don Pedro before
the SodFather.
We started the SodFather before we started today, because his message has really helped Joe and I to start right where we're at. So we don't have acreage where we live, but we were encouraged to start a backyard chicken flock. I say that was a COVID decision, right? Like,
oh yeah,
we
right.
got
You bought a
RV.
dog, had a baby, or got a new pet,
exactly.
right?
I stopped dyeing my hair, and we got a backyard chicken flock. But I thought, we can do this.
Yep.
This is doable.
Yep.
I'm not going to wait until we have a lot of land. We can do things right now. We bought a whole cow. City folk trying to find a cow in South Florida. That was an adventure, but it's because he made it feel possible for us. So we're so excited. All right, so Peter Ballerstedt, a.k.a. Don Pedro, the SodFather of the Ruminati, earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Georgia and his doctorate at the University of Kentucky. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 to 1992. He currently works in the forage seed industry. Peter's personal experience has led him to re-examine human diet and health. What he has learned doesn't agree with the advice given for the past several decades. Peter is an advocate for ruminant animal agriculture and the essential role of animal source foods in the human diet. He strives to build bridges between producers, consumers, and researchers across a wide variety of scientific disciplines, increasing awareness of metabolic health and the ruminant animals' agriculture's essential role in social, economic, and ecological sustainability. Peter has spoken at many different events in the U.S. and internationally, and many of his presentations are available on YouTube. Thank goodness for us. Peter and Nancy live in Western Oregon with their 2 dogs, Connor and Noni. It's our great privilege to introduce Dr. Peter Ballerstedt.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Howdy, everybody. Oh, come on. Thank you. It's great to be back together again. Thank you for this opportunity to Chris and Miriam. But most of all, thank you for showing up and supporting this. I'm looking behind me like there's something there. Isn't there supposed to be a slide up? Title slide? It's not showing here. They're stuck. Oh, excellent. So back here. So title slide. Wonderful. So as you heard my introduction, but I just want to tell people that this morning I posted on my social media a PDF of all the slides, a PDF of the references that I'll use in this presentation, a folder of JPEG single images of each slide. So go there, download them, and have at it. So there is an existential crisis, and that's the message I want to get across today, but a little bit more introduction so you know who's up here talking at you. I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. As was mentioned, I've worked in forage agriculture most of my adult life at university and in private industry. And I currently work for a forage seed company, but I'm not here as a representative of that company. Maybe we should define some terms. Agronomy, those are the sciences related to food and fiber production, soil management. Forage might need to be defined. That's any part of a plant that's fed to animals other than the separable grain. So lots of things can qualify as forages, not just grass. Ruminants might need a definition for some, although I suspect in this region maybe not as much as others. But you know, even-toed, hooved mammals, multi-compartmented stomachs, they chew a cud, that's the process of rumination. You know, cattle, sheep, antelopes, deer, giraffes. How many people knew a giraffe was a ruminant? Okay, we got some winners here. Excellent. So why am I here? Well, we all have our personal story, and this is mine. 2007, I realized I was a 51-year-old balding, obese pre-diabetic. I was introduced because Nancy had already been on the journey for 5 years. I was introduced to Protein Power, Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories was about to come out. And so today I'm just balding. We've heard of some miraculous things, but that ain't it. And so then in about 2010, I started writing and talking about what I call grass-based health. That is, that we can have healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy people as a result of forage and ruminant animal agriculture systems. Key message I want us all to take. Dr. Vega yesterday talked about pain points as impediments to change. I want us to internalize the idea that when we improve our health, we are in fact improving the world. And we shouldn't and we shouldn't listen to the voices that are going to come against us with other messages about why you shouldn't or couldn't or whatever. And part of my role is to just say, well, here's some other information. Okay, and that's all I'm trying to do here today. Because the truth is that we can have healthy people and healthy soils as a result of ruminant animal agriculture. There are 3 essential keys that motivate what I'm doing, and that is that animal source foods are essential, full stop. Okay? So they're essential if we look at public health. Because if we eliminate animal source food, public health is going to get worse, although it's hard to imagine that. I mean, goodness, what we've heard, what we've experienced. We can't have sustainable food systems. If you are not for animal agriculture, you are not for sustainable food systems. And culture, and tradition, and community. I mean, animal source food has been part of the human experience as long as we have been humans, which is more than 10,000 years. Right? It predates the Dietary Guidelines by just a little bit. And so I'm going to get wild and crazy, and I'm going to say, by my understanding, the preponderance of the high-quality scientific evidence that's available from all disciplines suggests that the greatest harm associated with animal source food consumption is from not getting enough. Okay, so we've got a reality of too little, and then a mythology, a narrative of too much. And I want to explore that a bit as we go along. It's key for people to understand that you can be overfed yet undernourished. And that malnutrition doesn't mean a caloric deficiency. Okay? Again, I made this point before that sustainable food systems require livestock in general, ruminant animal livestock in particular. I'm going to leave a lot of cards on the table, a lot of hostages to fortune, and I welcome interaction during the Q&A or later, okay? But here's one key sort of manifestation of this, that we can have animals as part of a food system, of a cropping system, an integrated livestock cropping system, and work is going on in this area, has been for decades. Okay? The reality is that ruminant animals remove far less nutrients from the area of production than other crops do. Understand what I'm saying? Okay, here's another thing to keep in mind though. The other crops are a very inefficient means of delivering those nutrients to humans. So here's a quick example. 70% of the phosphorus that would be removed by winter wheat is not digestible by humans. It's phytate. So what we're doing is we're extracting nutrients from the productive area and we're shipping them off to the human cities, the urbanized areas, And by 2050, it's estimated that over 70% of humanity is going to live in urban areas globally. And there's something else that's going on that should make this even more important. Some of you may be aware of this already. There's been a tremendous upward trend in input costs. This is one graph, but it only went through September of last year for the price of diammonium phosphate, for urea, and for potash. Urea as a source of nitrogen, diammonium phosphate for phosphate, and potash for potash. Potassium, okay. NPK, the three principal ingredients in fertilizer. Okay, so I updated this for April 6th. There's been a little change. We're at record prices for diammonium phosphate and urea, and we're darn close for potash. And this, again, is a trend that started before the conflict. This is going to take years to rectify. So, but ruminant animals, the vast majority of the feed that these animals consume is not human utilizable. Only 4% of the feed that's consumed by the global domestic livestock herd is human utilizable feed. Food. Feed human, food people. Sorry. Feed animals, food people. And in this study, a quarter of that grain was not human edible because of off-grade, spoilage, whatever. Okay? So only 3%. Now you could argue that soy cakes might be human utilizable, but just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And here's a specific example. These wonders of creation can take a high fiber, low fat, poor protein source and upcycle it into highest quality animal fat and animal protein, as well as minerals that are more bioavailable, as well as vitamins. We don't eat grass, just in case you were wondering. Okay, so this is in a dairy animal. This is New Zealand systems. Anybody who's not been to New Zealand, let me just tell you, the landscape doesn't look like here. So we're not going to do this kind of thing here, but we could do something with irrigated pasture. So this is a conversion rate of dry matter to milk, solids, on about an 8-to-1 basis. And if I had comparable feed value, in a beef animal, it would be 15, 16 pounds to 1, which sounds like a really good deal to me. Okay, there's lots of conversations about faux products, plant pucks, food-like substances. This is a concept that was given to me, and as soon as I heard it, I went, oh yeah. They're not producing protein. They're not producing food, they're processing food. They're taking substances that were already human utilizable, processing them, which usually means reducing their nutritive quality in some way, and producing this faux product. Versus the upcycling that takes place with the ruminant. Now, a lot of people have become aware of soil health and related issues. There's a lot of interest in something that's called regenerative agriculture. I'm really happy that people are finding out about this. Let me just point out the date on the quote. It ain't new, folks. We've gone through this incredible transition where we went from a majority rural population to now a majority urban, suburban population. Now, the last 2 years saw a little reversal of that, and some people are saying, maybe I don't need to live in there. And that's great. I'm all for you. I was born and raised in suburban Philadelphia, so I understand completely. But there has been work in this area for a very, very long time. That's the point that I'm making. Okay? And again, another quote from 1956, the year I was born. Grasslands of the world stand twixt a world of plenty and a world of famine. Between a land surface of green oases and a land of desert, between surface soil stability and accelerated erosion. Everything we do to produce food has an impact. Why do we not honestly look at the plant source food production and cast all the burden and suspicion on the animal source food production? And, by the way, as I've said before, there is no either or. They're integrated. So if you're a fan of organic produce, most of the fertilizer that comes for producing that produce is coming from livestock. So I've gotten to present papers at international events where I'm trying to raise awareness of metabolic health amongst the international grasslands community. And coming up in 2026, it's the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. And so I've had some connection into that community as well as the international grasslands. So what I'm wanting to encourage others to do is to take the metabolic health message back into their communities of profession. And let's spread this news, because as we've heard, chances are a lot of the people we work with are suffering from metabolic health problems. Okay. We have a long tradition of somebody coming along saying there's, in 10 years, in 20 years, in whatever number of years, it's all going to freeze, it's all going to melt, we're going to burn up or whatever it is. And there's a remarkably consistent record of these people being wrong. It's like the flippin' weatherman. You've been wrong for the last week, but what do you think about today? What we need to understand is we got dietary guidelines out of these kinds of projections. It goes way, way back, and it manifests itself in some very dark things. And then you've got this kind of thinking where, okay, here's half the people worldwide who need insulin to treat type 2 diabetes will not receive it in 2030 unless access is improved. Let's just speculate widely. What if there were some way that's been demonstrated in the literature of people reducing their need for insulin? Wouldn't that be another way? Wow, what could that be? Meanwhile, we have a crisis today. Now, these are figures from before we crashed the worldwide system over the last 2 years. And I can guarantee you it's gotten worse. If you live in a culture where there's not sufficient electricity to have cold shipment to provide food coming from production to consumption, where people don't have home refrigeration so that they must go to the market every day and they close down travel. So we've got 800 million people in the world that are calorically deficient. Starvation. At the same time, we've got 2.2 billion people in the world overweight or obese. We got 3 billion people in the world that are arguably malnourished by my definition. And that's pre-pandemic. And that's with some pretty poor metrics, as I understand from what I've been hearing from speakers. Undernutrition, again, is not synonymous with caloric deficit. Overfed, undernourished, protein to energy malnutrition is a horrendous problem. Globally, it tends to impact children most severely. So children globally, over half are deficient in micronutrients, iron, vitamin A, zinc. We've got somewhere close to a quarter of children under 5 years old globally that are stunted. This is not only low height to age, this is also cognitive brain development, which lasts a lifetime. Estimated in sub-Saharan Africa, the rate of stunting represents an 11% drag on GDP for development. Sorry. 7% are wasted, that's low weight to height. 6% are overweight. This is global. Think it's gotten better over the last 2 years? So anybody that's arguing for a plant-based diet, which when I hear it, my filters translate that to vegan. I just think that's what that is. Because otherwise I don't understand the advocacy, because humanity's diet's already plant-based. The vast majority of calories in humanity's diet are coming from plant-sourced foods. Well, where do we get energy from plant-sourced foods? 2 things. Carbs, okay, sugar and starch were the words I was looking for. Okay, those are the carbs that we can utilize. Cows and ruminants, they can use structural carbohydrates, fiber, okay? And if we're in the midst of this global pandemic, word chosen advisedly, of metabolic illness, is advocating more consumption of sugar and starch a good idea? Now, I'm not trained in human nutrition. I'm not that kind of a doctor. I'm just a simple agronomist, a ruminant nutritionist. But I just ask questions. The vast majority of cause of death across the globe is non-communicable disease. We just heard Dr. Harper talk about what that means, and others. But my, short-term memory, he was right here. Insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia are at least aggravating, if not causal factors. But it's global. Please get rid of this plagues of prosperity stuff. Half of adults in China, India, and the US. That's a lot of people. 80% live in low and middle income countries. Most don't know that they're affected or afflicted. Predicted 150% increase in type 2 diabetes by 2030. And obesity is a symptom, it is not the cause, but a lot of the conventional wisdom is still present in sustainable food conversations, in global food system conversations. We've got to get that demon exorcised. And the majority of crude protein in humanity's diet is coming from plants already. Humanity gets more crude protein from cereals than from all animal source foods combined. Wheat is the single largest source of crude protein in humanity's food supply. Think about that when we've got Russia, number 1, and Ukraine, number 5, in wheat export being taken out of business. But again, coming from my side, we have a lot of awareness of indispensable amino acids. And there are these specific targets in reducing stunting, wasting, and overweight in children. But it is not informed by this awareness of indispensable amino acids. It's informed by the old conventional wisdom. Please, can I find some people that I can introduce to this community of people that are trying to do this good work? The one at the bottom, subclinical kwashiorkor. I understand that kwashiorkor, which is the typical starvation sort of image that you have in the mind with a bloated belly but emaciated child otherwise, because the bloating is edema. The kwashiorkor means the sickness the baby gets when the next child comes. So you've had a child, had a baby being breastfed, new baby, wean that first baby onto cereal diet, which is deficient in the essential amino acids that the child needs, and then we see the sickness. But I believe this is cross all income, low, middle, and high income. And so I'm going to make the point that the existential crisis humanity faces now and in the future is this lack, this insufficient amount of animal source food for their diet. Whatever that, because when I say animal source food, I'm not just talking about red meat. Right? Dr. Rigby yesterday, daily meds, meat, eggs, dairy, seafood. Pick whatever is appropriate for you. Okay. But there's this weird sort of disconnect between what nutrition science would say and what the advocates recommend. It's very bizarre. And there's lots of possible explanations, but it's well outside my scope. Here's a manifestation, though. This is a global map of the incidence of stunting in children under 5. And you see the scale there, the magenta, I guess, is greater than 30% of children in those countries. Now, don't remember specific countries, but remember the pattern of the countries, okay? How that looks going across the map, okay? Let's look at another thing. This is mortality. This is the percent of adults at 30 who are going to die by 70 of various non-communicable diseases across, and you see that same sort of trend across the map, right? These Einsteins look at the diet in those very same countries and say that's the healthiest diet we need to be achieving. Now, forgive me, I'm an agronomist, so maybe I'm missing something. Maybe the doctors can help me here. These people are advocating for the diet that's producing the greatest amount of stunting and the earliest death among adults. Okay, but it gets worse. Let's come home. Here we come to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, latest edition, which is all about nutrient dense. And we got to be real careful with these people. We need to make sure we understand what they mean by words that we think we know what they mean. We got to make sure we understand the terms we're using. Okay, what do they mean by nutrient dense? Well, they mean explicitly low fat because they don't consider fat a nutrient. All fat can do is dilute other elements that they consider essential. This is their mindset, so they define it that way. Okay? So then we end up from that with this, where shredded wheat is nutrient dense, but frosted wheat is not. Now, I'm not advocating for frosted wheat, but shredded wheat, that vegetable oil, and by the way, it's industrial oil. There's no vegetable involved with this process, right? It's not carrots put in, oh, look, we've got vegetable oil. No. Vegetable oil is nutrient dense, but butter is not. This is the Dietary Guidelines. That, I would not argue that soda is something we should be consuming or is, nutrient dense, but sparkling water? Nutrient dense? WTF? And the truth is that people talk very confidently about ecosystems or food systems, and these systems are way more complex, maybe even more complex than we can think about, talk about, understand. This is just one example of sustainable beef. There are 24 different issues arrayed around the circumference of that circle. Each one of those should be a presentation. Thank you, Eric. My list is now longer. And a holistic view would have to look at all of those, right? Because they're interacting in ways that we don't fully understand. But it's all part, unfortunately, we tend to drill down onto only one of them. So greenhouse gases is the thing du jour. And what we don't understand, oh yeah, by the way, I just realized what that looks like. Wrong end, people. I mean, I love a good fart joke as much as the next guy, but it's belches, not farts. You're welcome. But if you only focus on one thing, then the rest of the system can react in a way that's not what you want. For example, if your sole focus is on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then you're in favor of more time in a feedlot. I'll just let that one ruminate for a while. So myopia is the death of sustainability. Myopia is the death of health. We've heard that again and again throughout this. If we just fixate on one thing, okay. And we're talking about improving our lives, and our lives are more than just merely what we eat, as important as what our food is. But at the risk of oversimplifying, let me just say, surely, if we're going to talk about sustainable food systems, we ought to acknowledge that plant source foods are of lower nutritional quality and value in a human diet than animal source foods. That's not controversial. But yet in all the conversations, again and again, they get treated as if they are. Here's some quick examples. Oh, first of all, let me come back. So if I have the same amount of isocaloric, same calorie content, two different diets, where all the calories are coming from plants or all the calories are coming from animals, clearly they're not going to have the same metabolic effect. And yeah, you can't do that. I understand. I'm making a point that fat from animal source food doesn't have the same, has a different metabolic effect from energy, calories coming from starch and sugar. Proteins and minerals, likewise, if I feed the same amount from plant source and animal source food, we don't get the same metabolic effect. And we need to acknowledge that our requirement for vitamins and minerals is largely influenced by the forms of food that make up our diet. And yet, frequently in sustainable food system conversations, people will focus on caloric yield per unit area. Again, we're in the midst of a global pandemic of metabolic illness. Is sugar really the best way? Because you can produce a lot of calories from sugar. I've spoken elsewhere about the difference between crude protein and true protein. There's a talk posted, Low Carb Down Under, of a talk that I gave at Low Carb San Diego. There's a lot of topics in there. Let me just focus on this one. This is from a paper that came out last year where they looked at 100 and some odd low and middle income countries, and they looked at the total crude protein supply. They compared that supply to some requirement, and they were able to split out the source. The orange bit at the top is from meat. The green bit on the bottom of each bar is from plants. But this is crude protein. Crude protein is not true protein. It's not the amino acids that we need. And so, but people involved in policy look at this and say, well, only those few down there at that low end are below the requirement, so protein is not a nutrient of concern. But if we correct for the amount of those amino acids that can be utilized, which is set by the amino acid that's present in the lowest amount, none of those meet the requirement. And that's before we ever consider whether that requirement is high enough. We've gone from where it isn't a concern, and apparently it should be. But don't think that we're out of the woods. There's similar data showing a similar problem in the United States, not the least of which is because the Dietary Guidelines use something called ounce equivalents, which from this paper were demonstrated to not be metabolically equivalent. Now let's take it to an environmental footprint. When we drill into it more appropriately, we begin to get animal source protein and plant source protein to be comparable in terms of their greenhouse gas emission intensity. And of course, we're not only getting protein, as important as that is, from animal source foods, we're getting shortfall nutrients from around, that are a major problem. Don't think that this is UK data. Girls 11 to 18 years old, 49% are deficient in iron. Women from 19 to 65, virtually 25%. And we can supply these nutrients with a much lower emission intensity from animal source foods than from plant source food. And then we need to add this little kicker in here, and I love this one. They've admitted now, thanks to some research, that because of the nature of methane in the environment, in the atmosphere, especially biogenic methane, methane that comes, we call it enteric methane, the methane that gets burped out of a cow, that remains in the atmosphere for approximately 10 years, but it came from the atmosphere when the plant produced the dry matter that the cow ate, so it's a cycling. It's not an enrichment of carbon. So they're acknowledging that now and saying that GWP, global warming potential 100, overestimated the impact of enteric methane by only 3 to 4 times. So when we look at lysine production from dairy instead of crude protein production, it brings dairy down by a factor of 100, makes it less than soy juice beverage, and that's before we apply the divide by 3 or 4. There are official statements out by organizations saying vegan diets not for pregnant, lactating infants, children, adolescents. And then I ask the question, what about seniors, old farts like me? There are studies that have shown that minimal amendment of diet, I'm talking 1 egg a day, in addition to whatever the typical diet is, produces measurable differences in school children's cognitive and scholastic performance by age 9. And we know now that old farts like me need a higher quality diet so that we can age healthfully, which I'm interested in. Okay, call me selfish. A lot of focus globally about the first 1,000 days of a human being's life, but a third of women globally are anemic. Vitamin B12 deficiency is widespread, and I think that's a problem in the United States as well. Only 40% of infants globally are exclusively breastfed for the first 6 months of their life. And then you really have to read into the footnotes a couple layers, because they'll play games with their terms, but in this case they say animal source foods are the best sources of high quality nutrients for children 6 months to 23 months of age. Hello, Professor Noakes. And this is, here you come, Chris, the World Health Organization. Thank you. 59% of children in that age group, however, do not get eggs, dairy, fish, or meat. And we've known from the data for some time that diets that are low in animal source foods are typically low intake of bioavailable iron and zinc, calcium, retinol, vitamin B2, B6, B12. So there's this disconnect between what we know from the research and what's being advocated. Okay, now let's take it We're rapidly running downhill toward the end. You've been very patient. But people want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions from animal source food production. But what's the footprint of chronic illness? So, quick review. All of agriculture in the United States is responsible, by latest estimate, for approximately 9% of greenhouse gas emissions, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Okay? All of animal source food production is responsible for 4%. So less than half of agriculture's is coming from animal source food production. And beef itself is responsible for 2% of the total, right? The American healthcare industry is responsible for 10 by some estimates. Healthcare industry is producing more greenhouse gas emissions than all of agriculture. Now, that's not an apples to apples comparison, and I admit that freely. The point is that healthcare has an environmental footprint. And by some estimates, the average American with type 2 diabetes uses pharmaceuticals equivalent to 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. One estimate was that if the average adult American could eliminate their medication use, is there such a thing even possible? What would that be? Okay, let's just speculate widely. If you could do that, you would reduce your carbon footprint 29% more than if you went from a high meat to a vegan diet. And everything I know is that a high meat diet is sustainable in the sense of you can stay on it. Okay. So if all of the diabetics, the type 2 diabetics, could eliminate their pharmaceutical use, and we're only talking about the diabetic medications, that would equal, in the United States, 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. What the heck does that mean? Well, that's 10.8 million passenger cars driven for 1 year equivalent. 4% of the registered passenger vehicles in the United States. That's 4.7 times the total cumulative sales of plug-in electric vehicles to date, as of December. So you want to reduce your environmental footprint, improve your health, make the world a better place. Meanwhile, we have professional burnout. Meanwhile, we have a mental health crisis. That's not sustainable. So part of what I'm doing is I'm calling for multidisciplinary investigations that can look at what constitutes a healthy diet for the metabolically ill as well as the healthy. Remember, the dietary guidelines are not intended for sick people. You know that. They say so. So fine, they can have the 12%. No, it's not fine, but investigate the vital role that animal source food plays in human development and health, the causes of non-communicable diseases, the essential role that ruminant animal agriculture plays in sustainable food systems, a science-based assessment of the environmental, societal, and economic impacts of the burden of non-communicable diseases, as well as animal source food production. We've been asymmetrically applying the precautionary principle, which is not the way you're supposed to apply it. You know, they assume, like they did in the first dietary goals, they assumed no harm, and they assumed that they were right about the benefits. Might be time for a reevaluation. And then a fresh perspective and approach toward communicating this information to the wider public. So here are some resources. They're free. You can look them up. Again, I've published these on my social media accounts, so we're getting close to the end. And speaking of social media accounts, here we are. And then the one I want to live up longer is this one. In case you're interested, I've put together a list of books. They're on Amazon. You know, some of the books I'd like to put there Amazon is way overpriced, but there's no way I can figure out how to put it there and say, don't buy it here, buy it there. So I'll work on that problem. But these are books that I found helpful across a range of subject matter. And if there isn't one on there, it doesn't mean anything. It's just these are the ones I put together. So with that, I thank you for coming again. I want to thank our MCs. I want to thank Chris and Miriam and everyone who's worked to put this on. I want to thank the vendors for their support. But most of all, I want to encourage all of you. If what I can do is lower the burden, the barrier to adoption, if I can be the analgesic to the pain points, I'm using terms I don't understand. But if I can help you in working with others or yourself, please feel free to contact me. And again, I'm here for the Q&A, and I'll be here for the rest of this event. Thank you very much.